Now, for many people in conflict zones around the globe, the choices, such as they are either adapt, migrate, or perish. And unfortunately, the same imperatives can apply to some native animals dealing with the pressure of climate change. A case in point is happening right now in southwest Western Australia. In the eastern states, the Brushtail possum is one of the most widely abundant marsupials on the landscape, but the same can't be said in WA, where there is a subspecies of Brushtail with the local name of the kumal. And after a year of tracking and observing this subspecies of Brushtail possums in what remains of their habitat, researchers are saying that long-term mapping predicts the kumal may have some real challenges ahead if they're to remain viable as a population. On Skype from Edith Cowan University is lead researcher and ecologist for the study, Dr. Sean Malloy. Sean, welcome to the program.
G'day, Michael.
Sean, what are the differences? I'm kind of intrigued by this. What are the differences between the kumal and the common brushtail?
Well, the kumal's a subspecies of the common brushtail, but it's much smaller. It's about half the size. It's much more carnivorous. Its fur's different, and it's a lot shyer. So we don't tend to see it move into the suburbs here like you do in the eastern states.
Which, of course, has been one of the great adaptations of the common brushtail. It's what's allowed it to not only survive, but thrive.
That's correct. So this is one of the reasons this subspecies here isn't quite as adaptable, and it has been declining throughout much of its range. But the common brushtail as a whole, although they're popular, still abundant on the east coast, throughout most of the country, because they used to be found right throughout the interior, they're now missing from nearly the interior of the whole country.
I didn't realise that. I didn't realise, when you say interior, are you including arid regions as well?
Yes. So they used to be found along small woodlands, in creek lines, and in a lot of areas throughout Australia. And these areas now, they're largely missing. Like everything else in this country, in general, they're declining, usually as a response of human activity.
And so when it comes to the kumal, is there lessons to be learned from the disappearance of the common brushtail possum in those parts you've just alluded to?
Well, what's affecting them here is largely what's been affecting them throughout the country as a species, but here possibly more so. And that's loss of habitat, introduced predators, cats and foxes particularly, changes in the way we manage the landscape, and more recently, we're seeing climate changes impacting on them as well.
And you, in talking to me about this yesterday, you mentioned to me that it's not like the kumal hasn't experienced climate change before.
No, climate change has happened naturally in the past, and species migrate, plants, animals will migrate and move in response to climate change. However, with people here, especially in the southwest of WA, a lot of the bushland is being cleared and adapted and changed. This is what we call landscape fragmentation, where once was all bushwood and habitat is now largely cleared, and we have tiny little patches or fragments of bushland out there. These tend to be degraded, and they tend to be very fragile because they don't have the resources to support a full suite of species. And for most species, movement between these patches is difficult and often impossible.
Right. So as climate change starts to insert its hold over various parts of our continent, what's tended to happen, and it's a generality here, but what tends to happen is as the temperatures tend to rise across the landscape, animals, plants who favour cooler climes tend to move further south. Is that even possible in southwest WA?
It's possible. It's a species-specific question, really, because what's a barrier to movement for a bird may not be, for a small lizard or marsupial, isn't a barrier for a larger marsupial like a kangaroo or a bird. It gets back to every animal responds differently, and we've got to understand how different animals are going to respond to the double whammy of climate change and fragmentation.
So you've been tracking and mapping the movements of the kumal across whatever remnant habitat is left for them in southwest WA. What have you discovered?
We found out that throughout most of the area, they can live quite happily whether they've got about 40% remnant vegetation cover. And as this remnant vegetation cover drops, then the probability of them surviving becomes much, much less. But we found where their needs are met, cats, foxes, other things, they can still persist, they can still survive out there. And we've also found that largely climate change is going to shrink their distribution, the area they're going to be able to persist in. But there are areas that we can identify where they're likely to persist.
And what kind of habitat or bush do the kumal most favour?
They like good woodlands, older woodlands that aren't too badly burnt or too often burnt, and they're going to persist better in those areas that we now consider really high rainfall. These are the areas more likely to persist because we've had seriously warming and drying climate in southwestern Australia. Our rainfall has dropped over 20% over the last couple of decades at the moment, and temperatures are rising dramatically. So we are seeing large areas of forest, the jarrah forest, where they were once abundant, are now starting to decline.
You know, what worries me too about these findings, Sean, is that these remnant areas of habitat that they most favour and that they're still able to survive in comfortably where possible are going to be the kinds of habitat that fall foul of super intense bushfire.
That's very much the truth. We're seeing that happening all around the country at the moment and the world. Climate change scientists have been long warning us of the mega-fire scenarios. As the world gets drier and hotter, we're going to get bigger and harder to control fires. They're going to be more intense. They're going to be more frequent. And species are going to have to learn to adapt to these. And it's getting harder and harder for nearly everything out there. We have all these human impacts. We're still pushing down bush. We're still logging in areas where we possibly shouldn't be logging. And through climate change, it's just getting so much worse.
Yeah, and we've heard the same old terms used, sadly, and as poignantly, when it comes to other native species around the country, depending on where they are and what kind of pressures are upon them. But these same kinds of terms and pressures come up time and time again. We're not going to reverse human settlement. That's clearly not going to happen, as much as some people may wish it. In terms of ensuring survival for the kumal and therefore keeping diversity in terms of the biosphere in that part of the world, what can we do to help them either adapt or migrate?
Well, that's the purpose of these models. We're looking at ways, what these species need, what they need to survive, and those areas they're most likely to survive. So we can do better, do our connectivity, put our wildlife corridors or our revegetation in the right places. We can identify the areas that are really important for the future and say, no, these areas have to be preserved. This is where, and we can start pointing to species as we do these models properly and we get better at them. We can start pointing to the species and exactly what bang for the buck we're going to get in these areas. We're not only going to say, oh, we've got to save the bush, but we can turn around and say, we have to save that bit of bush and this is why.
I have never seen a kumal, and I know you're going to send me a photograph later, Sean, so we can put it on the website. Sometimes cuteness factor plays a role in survival. Are they cute?
They are. They're about half the size of the brushtail over there. They're a little bit furrier, and I may be biased because I've gotten to know them over the years, but they're little thugs and they're thoroughly adorable.
Some of my favourite qualities all rolled into one. Sean, it's been really great to talk to you, and keep fighting the good fight. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Michael.
Dr. Sean Malloy, who's the senior research leader on this project, investigating not only the mapping and tracking of the kumal, but its possible viability into the future with so many pressures upon it, including climate change.